Thank you. Hello, Terry. Do we have
Hello there.
Terry on Spotlight? Hello there, Terry. How
Hello,
are
Vandra.
you? Dear?
Can you see me?
Welcome to Brooklyn Ethical.
Thanks so much.
We're just lining up the cameras on you and us. And thank you so much for coming to us today. Terry's presentation to us today, he gave at the American Ethical Union's assembly this past summer. So if there are some folks who might be coming in from the American Ethical Union, you may have be familiar with the topic. A little bit about Terry Smith. He earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin and published articles as well as a book on the philosophy of behavioral psychology. He retired as Dean of Arts and Sciences from Pennwest Edinboro in 2013, and he has been a member of the Washington Ethical Society since 1979. 1979. Whoa. So we go to this part. I'm going to put over to Lajira and Michaeline, who are going to take it from here. Okay. I might just be in the background a little bit of that. Podium, where's the podium?
Trying to get comfortable. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you kindly. Hello, Terry. I'm Lajira Cooper and a trustee here at Brooklyn Ethical. I am a science fiction fan, and in that space, I'm devoted to understanding and reimagining humanity. Michaeline and I are creating a mini workshop.
Could you just say that again, because and speak into the microphone because they can't hear.
I don't think this thing's correct. Dum 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 dum. Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Okay. Hello, Terry. I am Lajira Cooper and a trustee here at Brooklyn Ethical. I'm a science fiction fan and writer, and in that space, devoted to understanding and reimagining humanity. Michaeline and I are creating a mini workshop.
Hello, Terry. My name is Michaeline, and I'm a member of Brooklyn Ethical. I am thrilled by this topic and the universe that we'll be exploring together. We're eager to hear about the history and the definition of modern applied ethics and how ethical culture fits within that system.
Thank you, Michaeline and Lujira. I'm thrilled that you took the time to preview my presentation and add some questions that you can insert into various places. I love the idea. So let's get started. Can I pull up my slide now?
Yes, please.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
Great. I want to say just a brief word about myself, which is that I do have a PhD in philosophy, but it's in philosophy of science. and philosophy of psychology, not ethics or religion. And so I have no special expertise on this topic. But after I retired in 2013, I decided I didn't have anything more to say about philosophy of psychology. And so I turned my attention to ethics and started reading some of the founding documents of ethical culture. So what follows is my report on what I found. And what I have to say is not really my own opinion, but just reporting to you the opinion of philosophers who were outside the ethical movement about some of the ideas that were expressed by Adler during those founding decades, the 1880s and 1890s. And I have created an annotated bibliography, and at the end, I'll post my, and if you're interested in reading some of these articles and seeing if you agree with me, you could follow the bibliography. Most of the articles are available online. So any discussion of the founding of ethical culture must refer to Felix Adler. And my report is framed by an article written in 1988 by Marcus Singer, who taught philosophy at the University of Wisconsin. And by coincidence, I knew him personally. I played tennis with him and took a class from him on Kant's ethics. But that was more than 10 years before he wrote this article, and I didn't even know about this article until just a few years ago. The editors of the Journal of Humanism and Ethical Religion asked him to assess Adler's place in American philosophy, and he was well qualified to do that. He was an expert on both ethics and the history of American philosophy. He found that Adler had had no influence or impact on American philosophy as of 1988. But he also asked, is there an area where he should have had an impact? And his answer was applied ethics. And after Singer published that article in 1988, the field of applied ethics discovered Felix Adler. They found Adler's ideas about applied ethics to be original and valuable. These ideas were formulated during the founding years of ethical culture, roughly the 1880s and 1890s. They were published mainly in two periodicals, The Ethical Record, which was founded in 1888 and consisted almost entirely of articles written by members of the ethical movement for other members of the ethical movement. The International Journal of Ethics, which was founded in 1890 by Adler and others in the ethical movement, was an academic journal that had high intellectual standards. As its name implies, it addressed a worldwide audience. Its stated goal was to advance the knowledge and practice of ethics. In 1923, it would shorten its name to Ethics, and from that time forward would be published by the University of Chicago Press. Currently, it receives over 500 submissions per year and publishes about 24. It's one of the most influential and successful journals of philosophy. Adler's briefest and most emphatic statement on ethical culture's foundational assumptions appeared in this journal in 1894. Frederick Harrison had published an article in that journal that same year that asserted no ethical culture can determine conduct unless by an alliance with religion and philosophy. In other words, an ethical movement can only succeed if it is based on shared assumptions about religion and philosophy. Adler wrote a reply in the same issue. He said, if there's anything new in the ethical movement, it is its dissent from this widely accepted view. It's perhaps no surprise that Adler did not think ethical culture is based on shared religious assumptions. After all, its motto is diversity in the creed, unity in the deed. However, Adler also was saying that ethical culture is not based on shared philosophical theories. What did he mean by this? He meant it is not based on shared assumptions about the answers to ultimate questions. This sometimes gets obscured by the fact that Adler himself would later write books on some of these ultimate questions. Most notably, he wrote An Ethical Philosophy of Life in 1918. What he said in 1894 implies, however, that the ethical movement is not based upon his ethical philosophy of life, nor is it based on other answers to ultimate questions or any attempt to get to the bottom of things. Adler laid out the aims and methods of the ethical movement in an article published in 1890 in Volume 1, Number 1 of the International Journal of Ethics. He said the goals of an ethical society extend to the inner moral life. They are to gain a clearer perception of right and wrong, to study the practical problems of ethics, and to incorporate these insights into manners and institutions. To attain these goals, ethical culture relies upon a novel method. This method distinguishes between the first and secondary principles of ethics. What is a first principle? Justifications take a linear form. Imagine your 5-year-old child is staring at the broccoli that has just been served. Eat your vegetables. Why? Because they contain vitamins and minerals. Why do I need vitamins and minerals? To make you big and strong. If the string of justification stops here, then becoming big and strong is being presented as the first or ultimate principle of eating to your 5-year-old. An older child might ask, why is becoming big and strong so important? By then, we could offer a deeper justification. It is for the sake of health. And why is health so important? Well, for the sake of happiness. If the string of justifications ends here, then the pursuit of happiness is the first principle of eating. Adler gives 3 examples of first principles of ethics. The utilitarian principle that we ought to do whatever results in the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The Kantian principle that we ought to do whatever results in the the Kantian principle that the maxims of our actions should never contain a self-contradiction, and the Christian principle that we should always act out of love. His example of a secondary principle is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. This rule, he says, is by no means the whole of ethics, but it is useful. It offers practical guidance in some challenging situations. It receives support from the various competing first principles, but he says the golden rule itself is more certain than any of those first principles. Secondary principles of this kind bind the members of the ethical movement to one another. And now I want to take a brief pause and give a chance for Michaeline and Lujira to ask questions.
Terry, we would appreciate your elaborating on Adler's first principle, which was derived from the 18th century Immanuel Kant's principles, which states that maxims are not self-contradictory. Could you elaborate on that and give us some insight?
Well, Adler was a Kant scholar. His most professionally rigorous publication was a 1902 article in the respected British journal Mind, which was titled A Critique of Kant's Ethics. Kant called the supreme or first principle of ethics the categorical imperative, and he gave this principle several different formulations, one of which is the universal law formulation that you were referring to, that the maxims of our actions should not be self-contradictory when considered as laws that everyone would follow. That's the second example in the preceding slide. In his Mind article, Adler criticizes this formulation and argues that Kant's most important ethical insight was a different formulation of the categorical imperative that's often referred to as the humanity formulation, according to which no human being may be treated merely as a means to another's ends. Another question?
We've got some. Did Felix Adler incorporate other recognized ethical disciplines in his development of ethical culture? I have a list of some other disciplines, such as consequentialism, deontology, which was typically associated with Immanuel Kant, moral absolutism, moral pluralism, or moral relativism. Lots of isms, but not a lot of enlightenment at this moment.
Okay, so what about other ethical disciplines? Adler wanted to establish a school of applied ethics that would provide an alternative to the seminaries of the day. Those seminaries approached philosophy and applied ethics from a pre-established framework that he felt distorted them and limited the development of students. He thought those preparing to be ethical leaders should be familiar with all the major approaches to ethics. The founding of the school, unfortunately, was out of reach financially, but the ethical movement was able to mount a summer school of applied ethics that held its first session in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1891. Adler's contribution was a series of lectures that would be published in 1892 as The Moral Instruction of Children. His effort to create a school of applied ethics and his book about teaching ethics to children are two of the reasons cited for crediting him with the founding of modern applied ethics. Another question?
As you noted, Adler approved of the Golden Rule, yet he was critical of what he termed the general commandments of religion, such as love one another. I interpret these as polar opposite opinions. How are they consistent with Adler's rejection of religious traditions in favor of ethical culture?
Yes, well, Adler was critical of attempts to derive answers to the practical questions of applied ethics from a first principle, because they're too remote from concrete details that create the context for action. The golden rule, however, is not a first principle. It's easier to apply than a first principle. We know how we would like to be treated, and that can provide a useful rule of thumb about how to treat others. It's especially useful in novel situations that might confuse us. It nonetheless has limitations. It presupposes that my preferences are the same as those of others. But what if they have different preferences? They might not want to be treated the way I would want to be treated. It thus needs to be supplemented with other secondary principles. And those can come from any source, religious or otherwise. Another question.
When did Adler settle on his statement that we should always act so as to elicit the best in others and thereby yourself?
Okay, I'm not sure, but it does play a prominent role in his 1918 book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life. That's the first place where I find it being mentioned, but it might have occurred before then. The main point I want to make about that book and that principle is that they are Adler's attempt to address the ultimate questions of religion and philosophy. And he says in his preface, they are not the founding ideas of ethical culture. They're his personal philosophy, what he arrived at based on his life, his experience during his entire life. They are the sort of thing that Harrison said in 1894 ethical culture would need if it was to be successful, but Adler's reply was, if there's anything new in the ethical movement, it is its dissent from this widely accepted view. So, Adler thought these were important first principles, but ethical culture, as he presented it in the 1880s and 1890s, and I think as he understood it throughout his life, was not based on that philosophy. So I'm going to move on with the next slide, and then we'll come back to the two of you again later. Does ethical culture suffer from the absence of agreement among members on ultimate questions of philosophy? Not in Adler's opinion. This is because the goal of ethical culture is action. But the first principles of ethical philosophy fail to answer, in his opinion, the specific practical questions that ethical action poses. Indeed, he believed knowledge of ethics moves in the opposite direction. It starts with action, which results in ethical experience, which leads to judgments about particular cases. These judgments are more certain even than the secondary principles that bind us, he thought. These judgments sometimes indicate the need to revise or place restrictions on our secondary principles. They can even lead us to discard a given secondary principle and replace it with a totally different one, which I think is fortunate, because if you read Adler's ideas about the family and sexual ethics and so forth, you realize they're very dated and would be considered unacceptable today. But he did anticipate that we would need to change those principles. And to his credit, he even anticipated that in some cases we would totally reject the principles of his day and replace them with different ones. So let's take a pause here. Lujira, I think you have some questions.
Oh, stop coughing, I'd have questions. Allergies. Why did Felix Adler reject the need for any established moral theory in his development of ethical culture?
Well, that's a good question. He actually gives many reasons for rejecting moral theory as the basis of the ethical movement. And when you offer so many reasons for something, I take that to be an indication that this was a firm conviction on his part. Here are some of his reasons. First, that reasonable people cannot agree about moral theory. Secondly, if one were to enforce agreement about a moral theory on one's movement, then it would become a philosophical cult, and this would stifle its ability to incorporate new insights. A third is that the ethical movement is focused on action, but moral theories offer inadequate answers for the concrete problems of ethical action. And finally, he says, moral theories can even blind us to the insights that experience makes available to us. So, that we seek moral theories. He definitely sought moral theories to make sense of things in the way that philosophers are always trying to offer a comprehensive, coherent, consistent view of everything that they can think about. But those kind of theories aren't necessarily useful for forming an ethical movement. And I believe that that's what Adler believed. Lujira, another question.
Yes, thank you. I like the idea of a philosophical cult, especially what we're going through right now. Can you say a little more about why Felix Adler rejected humanism in favor of ethical culture, particularly since today ethical culture practitioners consider themselves to be a blend of both disciplines?
Okay, regarding humanism, Adler made an important decision when planning the address of May 15th, 1876, that marked the start of the ethical movement. He decided there would be no prayer and no worship. There were religious reformers and religious radicals of the day who tried to retain elements of prayer and worship, but give them a new meaning. Adler felt this was inauthentic. Prayer and worship are meaningful only if one believes in a personal God who hears prayer and is pleased by worship. Hence, from day one, ethical culture has been hospitable to humanists, atheists, and free thinkers. Why then was Adler critical of the humanism of his day? Honestly, I can only guess. When I read the Humanist Manifesto of 1933, which 1933 was the year that Felix Adler passed away, so he probably had an opportunity to, read it, or at least knew about its formulation, but I'm not sure that it had been published by the time he passed away. But anyway, it does have, to me, it has some of the appearances of a creed. But humanism has evolved since then. And when I look at Humanist Manifesto 3, which was adopted in 2003, and I look at the founding vision of the ethical movement of the 1880s and 1890s, it's difficult for me to see a conflict between the two. Okay, back to the slides. I think we're running kind of low on time, and so I'm going to skip what I think is inessential, which is talking about a British philosopher that Adler influenced, an important philosopher, but I don't think it's essential for us to cover him. So I'm going to jump ahead to 100 years after the ethical movement was founded. More than 100 years. Piers Norris Turner, in the journal Ethics, which the ethical movement had founded, wrote that Adler had the following insight: shared ethical values can be explored and have social authority independent of the truth of any controversial philosophical foundations. He also says that the journal Ethics itself continues to pursue its original aim, which was to establish a public morality that represents well-intentioned individuals holding a diversity of philosophical and religious commitments. This also, according to Turner, is what he understands to be the aim of ethical culture, as Adler described it. The assumption that there is a method for reaching agreement among people of goodwill on many, but of course not all, practical questions of ethics is the basis for the modern discipline of applied ethics. This discipline has led to advances in the ethics of scientific research, medical ethics, journalism ethics, judicial ethics, and other applied areas. It has established a consensus among people of goodwill about practices such as revealing the risks as well as the benefits of a medical procedure, fully disclosing any source of potential bias that might influence one's reporting, revealing to a legal client any conflict of interest one might have with their interests. Bert Heinrichs, writing in 2018, credits Adler with being the founder of applied ethics in this modern sense. Heinrichs explains what he means by applied ethics in the modern sense. It is a method for deriving answers to practical questions from intermediate principles supported by the specific, and these intermediate principles are supported by the specific judgments of people of goodwill. This contrasts with the older, more traditional sense of applied ethics that consisted of attempts to derive answers to practical questions from the first principles of ethics. To briefly summarize the main ideas of the founding principles of ethical culture in the 1880s and 1890s, they are that applied ethics can proceed without appealing to ultimate first principles, and that it can build upon the ethical judgments of people of goodwill from all walks of life. During the last half century, applied ethics has burst onto the philosophical scene and is now one of its flourishing subdisciplines. The methodology on which ethical culture was founded is now also the basis of research on questions such as the ethics of human subject research, medical ethics, journalism ethics, judicial ethics, and so on. This does not, however, mean that Adler influenced these fields. His position is analogous. His position as founder of applied ethics is analogous to the position of Gregor Mendel as the founder of genetics. Mendel was the first to discover the foundational principles of genetics, but he published them in an obscure journal, and his article had virtually no influence. Darwin had a copy of the journal in his library, but probably never read it. Roughly 3 decades later, Hugo de Vries and Thomas Hunt Morgan derived these same principles experimentally. De Vries for plants and Morgan working in the fruit fly lab at Columbia University for animals. And subsequently, they acknowledged Mendel's priority of discovery. A similar process has occurred with Adler's ideas about applied ethics. His ideas have not influenced modern applied ethics, but the fact that these ideas have been developed independently 100 years later is itself, I believe, confirmation of their cogency. Let me pause for questions again. Lujira, I think you have some.
Yeah, Piers Norris Turner cites Adler as the guiding force behind the International Journal of Ethics, now Ethics. What role did Adler actually play in the preparation and publication of ethics?
Well, actually, the group of full-time leaders edited and published the journal up to 1923, at which point they decided it required too many resources to justify continuing in that role. And then the University of Chicago took over the editing and publishing of the journal. Another question?
Yeah, before that, I now I understand sort of applied ethics, looking at journalism and other medicals. So it just sort of makes sense now.
Uh-huh.
Bert
Great.
Excuse me, Bert Heinrichs hypothesizes that Adler was the founder of modern applied ethics. Can you say more about the state of current applied ethics and its philosophical tradition?
Well, yeah, modern applied ethics can be dated from the 1970s, roughly. It was especially prominent in addressing questions of biomedical ethics, the ethics of human and animal research, journalism ethics, legal ethics, business ethics, and so on. At this point, there may be more PhDs in philosophy devoting themselves to various forms of applied ethics than to any other subdivision of philosophy. Prominent figures in medical ethics were Tom Beecham and James Childress, who developed an approach with 4 secondary principles: respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, justice, and beneficence. Each of these principles must be balanced with the others when applied to concrete cases. Michaeline?
Yes, I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to ask you questions. I'm throwing out some suggestions that we had considered, such as the death penalty and euthanasia, but I invite the audience to fill in those gaps.
Hey, hi Terry, Tom Castelnuovo. Glad you can go ahead and join us. Good to see you again.
Yes.
So I have a question about Christianity. So concurrent with the decline of Christianity in this country has been an explosion of New Testament biblical scholarship, and I'm a particular fan of Bart Ehrman, for example. And what he's writing on now is taking a look at demythologizing Christianity and then writing about Christianity as a religion of ethics. And I was wondering if you thought that Christianity ultimately ends up being a religion of ethics, and in parallel with that, whether Adler took a look at the ethical components of Christianity in developing ethical culture.
Okay, great question. Well, in that book on the moral instruction of children, he makes use of biblical stories, parables, um, and other stories from the Bible. So, Adler was not opposed to making use of materials derived from religion, whether Christianity or Judaism or any other religion. If they taught principles that could be applied to practical questions, practical problems of ethics. I do think that I want to just say something about the kind of questions that Adler thought ethical culture should be dealing with. He says in several articles in the 1880s and 90s that ethical culture is not only about doing good for those outside the ethical movement, it is also about the personal ethics of those inside the movement, noting that we're familiar with, say, the social reformer who ignores the most basic responsibilities to family and friends. And he thought an ethical society should benefit its members by helping them with personal aspects of their lives. And these presumably are some of the areas in which they'd be incorporated into manners and institutions, which, in his list of the 3 different purposes of ethical culture, it was to incorporate the insights into practical ethics into manners and institutions. So I would think that some of the secondary principles of possible relevance in this type of application would be things like honesty, promise keeping, gratitude, repairing harm. And those are certainly things that Christianity and almost any religion talks about. An important part of moral life has to do with applying those kind of principles. So I would think, I'm not sure what Christianity conceived of as an ethical religion would boil down to, because I think one of the things about Christianity is that it left a lot of ethical questions unanswered. So I'm not quite sure how it would be interpreted as an ethical religion or as a religion based on ethics when so many ethical questions are unanswered. But
Okay, let's interrupt. Barterman's book should be out sometime in 2025. It addresses that specific question. Looking forward to it.
Okay, yeah, good. Thank you.
Terry, we have some questions on Zoom for you. There's about 3 questions. I wanted to call your attention to first. D. Kirshner asks, in choosing the actions to prioritize for the ethical movement, what questions or criteria did Adler consider?
When I read accounts of his life, I'm just amazed at how many different activities and issues he was involved in. And I think he must have felt torn in many different directions. He was helping people, he was counseling people who were facing illness or bereavement, problems with their marriage, and yet at the same time, he was addressing some of the issues of New York City and New York politics. And he was also addressing international questions. So I'm not, he tried to do it all. He really did. And that's a pretty high standard, and to aspire to address all the things that Adler addressed. And I don't think he gave a specific set of priorities, but he did have some cautionary words. In 1896, there was an international, the first international conference of the ethical movement that was held in Zurich. And Adler was very unhappy with the European ethical movement. And the reason was that the European ethical movement focused entirely upon social ethics. So they would discuss various problems of social ethics, and then, if possible, they would attempt to act on them. And he felt they completely ignored personal ethics. And that's why he thought ethical culture should should have a congregational basis, so that, the questions of personal ethics could also be addressed. So he wanted to address all of the issues of practical ethics, including personal ethics. And he felt a need to emphasize that because there was a tendency to look at all the amazing things that the New York Society for Ethical Culture in particular had done during the first several decades of its existence. And people thought, wow, that's what ethical culture is about. But Adler said, yes, that, but also it's a congregational movement that is concerned about personal ethics.
I have a question. Well, actually, I have a comment and then a question. In the 1880s and the 1890s, the country was in extraordinary turmoil. And the same for as we approach the 1930s. Did Adler have any understanding or appreciation of impacting outside of a fairly narrow intellectual group? And if so, how?
I think so. He was one of the persons who organized the international conference that tried to address racial questions and questions of colonialism in the early 20th century, and was certainly against colonialism. But these are really big issues, and he was very frustrated. If you read some of the things that he says, he talks about, especially toward the end of his life, how difficult it is to have an impact on these larger issues, which he wanted to have an impact on, but realized he couldn't. But he did feel it built a movement that could at least change the lives of the people it could reach within the movement. And I think that must have been some comfort to him. But on the larger questions that he tried to address, well, those are very difficult for anybody to have an impact on.
Thanks so much, Terry. We've got one more question on Zoom. Ken Novak has his hand raised. And Ken, if you're
Okay.
ready to share your question, I'll unmute you.
Okay, great.
Be the last question.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Terry. When I heard your talk in Minneapolis, it just blew me away. I tell people a humanist is someone for whom the Bible is the whole world. And and in reading the article, his article from that first journal issue, I'm struck by, like, he was actually saying to these students at Cornell, and in the article, if you meet the philosopher at the crossroads, elicit the best in them as you would anyone else. Your take on that, on my take?
Yeah, you're right. He was, well, his first article in that first issue of the International Journal of Ethics was actually a reprint of, as you say, an address he gave to students at Cornell. And he had a kind of electrifying effect on students at Cornell. However, he was not hired there because, well, some wealthy donors had wanted to found a chair there for him, and Cornell, quite correctly, I think, said, well, people can give money to us, but they can't decide who we hire with that money. And that's a principle that all universities follow, I believe, or should follow, that donors can't get involved in making decisions at that level. Yeah, he was very good at interacting with students. And I think it adds to the meaning of that article to realize it was read before an audience of undergraduates who were quite enthused about what he had to say.
So thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Terry, for
Yeah.
being here.